Our last concept for this chapter is concept 31.5. It says fungi play key roles in nutrient cycling, ecological interactions, and human welfare. Fungi interact with other organisms as decomposers, mutualists, and pathogens, which we've kind of already mentioned. They're both beneficial and detrimental to mankind. There are lots of positive ways that we use fungi, and there are lots of positive interactions between fungi and other creatures in the environment. And then there's also some negative. There are some fungi that are parasites or pathogenic, can make humans ill or give humans various diseases and problems. So let's briefly take a look at what some of those might be. First off, we know that fungi are decomposers, and they are a key part of our ecological environment as decomposers, recyclers of nutrients. They are very efficient decomposers of organic materials, including cellulose and lignin. Lignin and cellulose, lignin in particular, is a very tough material that makes up wood, and these various types of fungi are some of the few creatures that can actually break that lignin apart into smaller types of molecules that can then be used by a wide variety of creatures. They perform essential recycling of chemical elements between the living and the non-living world, and without the fungi being able to break down and recycle these nutrients, life on our planet would not be able to continue as it does. Fungi are also used in bioremediation projects, so we are now using this ability of fungi to break down and recycle materials in ways that nature never had them do before. So where we might have certain types of environmental sort of catastrophes, maybe some sort of oil spill or some other contamination spill, there are certain varieties of fungi that can actually be used to break that material down into its constituents to where it won't be so harmful to the environment. So as decomposers, they are very helpful in the natural world as well as in the man-made world. Fungi also serve a very important role as mutualists. We already talked about these various relationships, these mycorrhizal relationships that a lot of fungi have with plants. They form these mutualistic relationships primarily with plants, but also with different forms of algae, cyanobacteria, and sometimes even animals. All of these relationships have profound ecological effects. Oftentimes plants have a tremendous benefit from these mycorrhizal relationships with the fungi, where they are able to grow better and take in nutrients faster and water, all because the hyphae of these various fungi provide this absorptive ability that the plant roots alone cannot. So the fungus-plant mutualism is probably the most important. They are enormously important in the natural, just out there in the forest type world, but also very important in the agricultural world. We use these fungi tremendously in agriculture to increase crops and to increase the vigor of the crops that we grow. Some plants harbor harmless symbiotic endophytes as well, fungi that live inside leaves or other plant parts. So it's not only in the roots where you sometimes have these mutualistic symbiotic relationships, but there are some plants that have fungi in other parts of the plant, and we would call those endophytes. And endophytes, for example, in some plants create certain toxins, release certain chemicals that either deter herbivores, like maybe they put out a chemical that helps keep deer from eating the plant, or they defend against other pathogens like other protists or bacteria. Most endophytes are ascomycetes. So that fourth group of creatures, that fourth group of fungi that we looked at, the ascomycetes, many of the endophytes that have these relationships with plants in places other than the roots are ascomycetes. Your textbook gives a good example of an endophyte benefiting this particular woody plant, and they have these leaf mortality and leaf area damage percentages here on the left hand side, and what they're measuring is the endophyte not present and the pathogen present, and the endophyte and pathogen both present. So the yellow shows you that the endophyte is not there but the pathogen is, compared to the damage where the endophyte is there and the pathogen is. So you can see in both these cases, when the pathogen is there, the plant does better when it has the endophyte. In leaf area damaged and in leaf mortality, the numbers are lower when the endophyte is present. So there is some mechanism where that fungi is assisting the plant in fighting off this pathogen, or preventing attack by this pathogen, or perhaps helping the plant recover from this attack by this pathogen. At any rate, it's a mutualistic relationship that benefits the plant. Although it's a little bit more rare, there are even some fungi or fungus animal symbiosis as well. Some fungi share their digestive services with animals, and these fungi help break down plant materials in the guts of cows and other grazing mammals. So not only are there in the stomachs of a cow, you're going to find an entire ecosystem of protists, and you're going to find bacteria, and you're going to find fungi as well. So just like we talked about how the cows and some other creatures have various types of bacteria and protists inside of them, many of them also have various types of fungi that help them break down their plant material. Many species of ants use the digestive power of fungi by raising them in farms. There's a type of ant called a leaf cutter ant. It doesn't cut and harvest the leaves to eat because it can't do a good job of digesting the leaves. What it does do, though, is it cuts and harvests the leaves, and it chews them up and basically makes them all wet and sloppy with ant spit, and chews them up into tiny pieces, and then basically provides that material for a fungi that it grows inside its anthill. And the fungi can break that leaf material down, and the ants actually live off of the fungi. So the ants are growing the fungi as a crop, much like you would tend to your garden, or your mom or dad grows tomatoes and corn and celery and things like that out in the garden. Well, these ants are growing fungi. They are actually little farmers, and here they are taking their leaves to their crop, to their fungi, because the fungi has the ability to break down the leaf and turn it into nutrients, and the plants can eat the fungi itself and get those nutrients. Another great example of a symbiotic relationship, this one is between fungi and a type of algae. It's called lichen, and lichen is usually thought of as an individual creature, a separate creature, but it's actually an association of two different types of living creatures. A lichen is a symbiotic association between a photosynthetic microorganism and a fungus, and these two creatures are so biologically intertwined that they really can't be separated. We treat them as one, even though they are two separate living creatures. Millions of photosynthetic cells are held in this mass of fungal hyphae, and the photosynthetic component is usually green algae or cyanobacteria, and the fungal component is usually an ascomycete. Again, that fourth category of fungi we were looking at. So when you combine these two together, they have developed such a close relationship that we treat them as one creature, but it will usually be some form of green algae or cyanobacteria mixed with some sort of ascomycete, some fungus. There's actually numerous different types of lichens. Here is a crustose lichen, which is usually kind of the hard, crusty kind you find on rocks and bricks. Here is a foliose or leaf-like lichen, and you can tell from its name it looks more like lettuce or leaves. And then you have a fruticose or shrub-like lichen that looks more like tiny little branches. So surely you've probably seen different kinds of lichen growing on the side of a tree or growing on an old gravestone. Well, that lichen is a symbiotic relationship between usually a photosynthetic algae or cyanobacteria and a fungi of some kind. This symbiosis is amazingly complete. I mean, we consider it one creature because in many ways these creatures in some cases can no longer even live apart. So this symbiosis is so complete that oftentimes we give these lichens scientific names as if they were one creature. The algae or cyanobacteria occupy layers inside of the mycelium or the hyphae of the fungus. So here's a great picture. This is a colorized, this is going to be a scanning electron microscope photo, and then it's colorized to show you the algal cells and the fungal hyphae. Here's that same picture with an illustration. So all of what looks like noodles here is going to be the fungal hyphae, and then within that there's going to be a layer of algae. And so the algae does photosynthesis, and the fungal hyphae help bring in nutrients and water. And so the two together get everything that they need. Again, the algae provide the carbon compounds through their photosynthetic ability. The cyanobacteria also provide organic nitrogen, and the fungi provide the environment for growth. And the fungi of lichens can reproduce sexually or asexually, so they are still two separate creatures. They still reproduce separately and apart. Asexual reproduction is done by fragmentation or the formation of something called ceridia, small clusters of hyphae with embedded algae. So usually lichens, when they reproduce, they do so asexually just by breaking pieces and parts off, or kind of like growing new clumps of this formation of this combination of the fungi and the photosynthetic creature. Lichens are really important in our environment because they do a lot of breakdown of materials. They create new soils. They're what we call pioneer species. Oftentimes they are the very first living creatures to appear, the very first living land creatures to appear on new land. Like, for example, if you think about the formation of the volcanic islands of Hawaii, at first there's going to be nothing there but raw rock. Well, lichens are usually the pioneer species that began to break down that rock and form the very first soils, and then from that point you start to have other plants and animals come on board, and before you know it you have the formation of soil and you have the Hawaii that you see today. Our best genetic and fossil evidence says that lichens may have helped the colonization of land by plants approximately 550 to 600 million years ago, and so these are very important species to the ecosystem as a whole. Now, one thing about them is that they are very sensitive to pollution, so they're also kind of a good indicator of when the environment is not as good as it should be, because they are very sensitive to the uptake of various chemicals and pollutants in the air around them. So if you start to see lichens die off or the lichen population begins to drop, they're kind of like a signal organism that can tell you that the air quality is going south, that there's more pollution perhaps than there used to be in a particular area. Finally, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about the bad fungi, the fungi that can be pathogenic, that can cause problems, diseases in either plants or animals. About 30% of the known fungal species are parasites or pathogens, mostly on or in plants, but occasionally in animals as well. Each year about 10 to up to 50% of the world's fruit harvest is lost due to different types of mold and fungi. As Hank Green mentions, if you watch the Crash Course video, he mentions that some fungi that attack food crops are toxic to humans and can cause some pretty bad symptoms, and even symptoms of hallucinations and temporary insanity, and you'll find out why in just a second. Here's some good examples of various pathogenic fungi in plants. This one forms something called corn smut. This is tar spots on maple leaves, and these black portions that you see are ergots on rye. So these are all various infections, I guess you could call it, of different pathogenic fungi. The ergot of rye that you saw is caused by an ascomycete, and it produces a wide variety of chemical toxins. And the problem can be when that rye or that wheat is harvested and it's then dried and turned into grain and flour, some of those toxins can still be in the flour, and then if that's ingested by a human, that can cause some problems. Actually, more than 40,000 people died from an epidemic of ergotism, which would be basically the illness caused by this ergot of rye during the Middle Ages. Ergotism is characterized by gangrene and nervous spasms and burning sensations, hallucinations, temporary insanity. And some of the reason is that the ergots contain lysergic acid, and lysergic acid is actually a raw material for the psychedelic drug LSD. So if you've ever heard of people taking LSD and they have these crazy hallucinations and insanity type moments, well, this is kind of a natural version of that, causing all sorts of problems and can even cause death on occasion. For the most part, animals are much less susceptible to parasitic fungi than are plants, although there are some cases where you see this. There's a chytrid. Remember, the chytrids are the ones that have the flagellated zoospores. There's a chytrid lately that has been causing a huge amount of death in amphibians worldwide. There have been thousands of species of frogs that have been brought to the verge of extinction by this particular chytrid that seems to have kind of developed fairly recently. And so you can look up frog death or chytrid frog death. This particular chytrid, Dendrobatidis, is causing a huge problem all around the world with amphibians, frogs and salamanders and the like. There's also a fungal disease in bats called white nose syndrome, which has been sort of in the news in the last 5 or 10 years. It's been devastating bat populations in North America. There's a quick little article there about white nose syndrome. That's also caused by a fungal infection that seems to attack the bats primarily when they are hibernating in their caves, and causes various problems there. Here's an example of that chytrid that we were talking about, that there's a whole grouping of frogs here killed off by an infection, and some of these populations of frogs have been decimated in certain areas by this particular fungal infection. The general term for any sort of fungal infection in an animal is called mycosis. Think about the different types of mycelium, and the myco word there indicates it's fungal related. So a mycosis is any sort of infection caused by a fungi in an animal. Good examples in humans or other mammals would be ringworm. That's not a worm at all. It's actually a fungal infection. So you get this raised circular area on the skin that's called ringworm. Well, that's actually a fungal infection, a mycosis. Athlete's foot or jock itch, both of those are fungal infections of the human body as well. Systemic mycosis spread throughout the body in some cases and can be pretty dangerous. There's a particular type of infection called coccidiomycosis that can get fungal spores within the lungs and cause all sorts of tuberculosis-like symptoms and can cause death if left untreated. And then some mycosis are opportunistic. In other words, you have these fungi in your body or on your body, but they don't really cause a problem until they begin to overpopulate. So in some cases, maybe your defenses are down, maybe your immune system is compromised or something like that, and when that occurs, these fungal infections kind of grow out of control. And a good example is with a type of yeast called Candida albicans. Candida albicans causes thrush, which is like a mouth infection. It can also cause yeast infections in the vaginal area of women and things like that. So these yeast are actually always within your body, within your mouth and other areas of your body, but they're usually held under control, and the populations are held under control. But in certain conditions, they kind of grow out of control and overpopulate, and then you would consider that a fungal infection, a mycosis. Of course, it's not all bad news. There are some practical uses of fungi, not to mention the natural benefits of fungi in the ecosystem, but there are some human practical uses of fungi. Humans eat many fungi, and we use a lot of them to make things like cheeses and alcoholic beverages like beer and wine. You couldn't do that without various forms of yeast and other fungi. And breads, you have to have yeast to make bread rise. And so they're oftentimes used in the food making process for humans. Some fungi are even used to make antibiotics against bacteria for the treatment of bacterial infections. Probably the most well known is penicillin, made from the Ascomycete penicillium. This was the first antibiotic that was widely used, and its discovery is credited to Alexander Fleming back in 1928. Here's a good example of this. Is a bacteria Staphylococcus, and where the penicillium is growing, you can see it puts out a toxin that inhibits the growth of the bacteria. So there's a good example in a petri dish of how it reacts inside your body. We have done all sorts of genetic research and continue to do genetic research on a variety of fungi in biotechnology. For example, scientists are using Saccharomyces to study homologs of the genes involved in Parkinson's and Huntington's disease. So you would think, even though fungi and humans are not that closely related, there are some homologous sort of genes that we can study in them that might give us an insight into our own diseases and problems. And then of course we can also use fungi to produce certain chemicals for us. Insulin-like growth factors can be produced in the fungus Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that one right, but this particular fungus can be kind of coaxed or genetically altered to produce insulin materials, like for people who have diabetes and the like. So altogether, fungi are an amazing, unique, fascinating sort of kingdom of life under the domain Eukarya. Maybe not one we think about as being closely related to animals, but now we know they are indeed more closely related to us than they are to plants. So we've hit on 3 of the 4 kingdoms so far under Eukarya. So under the domain of Eukarya, we've hit on the Protista, which is not really a kingdom anymore, but we're still calling it a kingdom just for convenience sake. We've hit under the plants, the plantae or the plantae, and now the fungus, the fungi. And the only one left is Animalia, of course, and that would include all the animals, including us. So that's where we will go next. I'm going to leave you for this chapter with a couple of nice slides. We won't really talk about them, but they do give you some basic information. So first, here are the fungal phylums, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 major groupings of fungi that we talked about. and just a brief mention of their distinguishing features. This would be an excellent slide to kind of look at, to kind of remember what are the differences between the different fungi we talked about. Here's a very kind of basic brief slide of reproduction of fungi using those words plasmogamy, karyogamy, and it shows you sexual and asexual reproduction. Maybe something to keep in mind. And then here are again the 5 that we looked at, showing you how chytrids are perhaps the most ancient form from the common ancestor all the way down to the mushrooms, the basidiomycetes that we looked at last. So we're going to end right there with chapter 31, all about fungi. I highly suggest you take a look at the crash course videos or maybe the Bozeman Science videos as well. And if you're having trouble with the vocabulary, use something like Quizlet or something to that effect. Take a look at the chapter summaries. They're very good as well. And then if you have any questions, shoot me an email or post it up on the update portion of the website, and I'd be happy to answer. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.